In this section, we will be talking about debt, such as loans or credit cards, how that works, and the math that goes into paying them off on time. But a statistic to begin with, um, and again, this is a few years old, but 64% of Americans are concerned about their debt. So roughly two-thirds of all of America, and these numbers probably have vastly increased since the pandemic, but a lot of Americans are concerned about their debt. They are stressed or worried about it, and it's something that you know if I, in my personal opinion, if you understand your debt, what you're up against, and what are the implications, I think it makes it a little bit less concerning. Like I personally would say that I'm not concerned about my debt, not that I really have that much. So it's probably not necessarily an apt comparison to a lot of people, but I feel like people who don't really understand their debt, that or have fears about paying it back, are those who suffer the most concern. Sorry, my dog is barking. Hopefully, you can't hear that too much. But like often the ways we get ourselves into debt are buying things that we can't really afford or that we don't have the money for, such as buying a home, buying a car, buying stuff on our credit card, or whatever. And so I mean, there's a difference between buying something we can afford and buying something we can't afford, and this is something that's kind of an important distinction. And it's not necessarily a black and white thing, and it's more of a opinion for someone. Like, say for example, you qualify for a home loan. It doesn't necessarily mean you can afford it, and really, it's kind of up to you and your financial goals in terms of am I willing to you know, put this much interest into an investment. And that's kind of the math I wanted to work towards is how do home loans work and all that other stuff. Excuse me, but most typically, let's say you're trying to buy a house and you get like a 30-year mortgage. Basically, it's like you're going to borrow a whole bunch of money up front, say for example, $500,000 for a house or whatever, and you'll be paying that off usually on a month by month basis for, say, the whole 30 years of that mortgage, which is often referred to as an installment loan because you're not paying it all back at once, right? But you're paying that $500,000 off in small chunks every month for the whole 30 years. And the amortization formula is a mathematically solved formula for how much do I need to pay off to actually do it in time, and that's what we'll be looking at. Before we get to that, though, let's do a simpler example of debt and just kind of look at uh, what will happen. But like, let's start with credit cards. Credit cards are actually very useful things because they allow us to buy things even if if we don't have the money right away. But it's not really financially wise to be putting a bunch of money onto your credit card if you don't have that money to pay it back, or if you're not going to have enough at the end of the month. Because if you don't pay off a credit card, typically their interest rates are very, very high, and it can be a slippery slope for a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans buy a lot of things on their credit card and then they aren't unable to pay it back. And for those who are unable to pay it back, usually the extreme interest rates on the credit card make it harder and harder and harder to pay it back over time due to the nature of compound interest. But while credit cards can be dangerous, a key thing is if you do pay them back at the end of each month in full, you will not be generating interest. So there's like no cost to actually using them unless you don't pay them off. If you don't pay them off, that's when interest will accrue on your balance, and that's kind of the important thing to know. And I've had quite a few students ask me, uh, someone told me that I shouldn't pay off my full balance or that I should leave a balance on my credit card each month. And that that's something that is very situational, but it kind of has to do with how credit accrues. I have good credit and I pay off my credit card every month. I don't like interest just because it's like if I'm paying interest, that means I'm giving away money that I didn't actually, it wasn't actually my money, right? It was extra money on top of what I borrowed or paid with, and I don't really like that. I prefer to if I'm going to buy something, not to pay interest on it. So it's just my personal mantra to not do that. But there could be an argument for leaving a balance on your credit card if it does involve building your credit. But you can build up good credit without having to actually leave money on your credit card. And since credit cards have such high interest rates, I think that there's better ways of building credit personally than doing that. But let's look at an example. Let's say that you purchased a TV for $800 and you put it on your credit card. Um, and let's just say that we look up our credit card's APR, which is 25%, which is very high in comparison to the examples we're doing. But credit cards typically have extremely high APR, which is why you want to be very careful. And let's say that you didn't pay your credit card bill right away because you had to get your car fixed and you used all your money on that unexpectedly. You were originally planning to pay it off, but then you couldn't. And let's say that it was originally due the 1st of January and you haven't been able to pay it off and is now July 1st. How much is it at, and what is our current balance after 6 months? So let's move back to the packet, because this is in the packet, and we'll work on it from there. But basically, credit cards typically will use compound monthly because every month you're going to get a credit card statement which will indicate the balance, and it will grow based on the balance of your credit card every month. So in this consideration, our principal is going to be $800 because that's how much we put on our credit card to begin with. The interest rate is 25%, which is 0.25 as a decimal, and N is going to be 12 since it needs to be compounded monthly. Now, the time frame here, it was the 1st of January to the 1st of July, which is 6 months. But remember that it's important to not plug in 6 for time because the time must be in years, not in months. So if I plugged in 6 into this would give me 6 years of growth, and this is going to be way, way wrong. But if I want to do 6 months and convert it to years, well, there's 12 months in a year, so it would be 1/2 of a year, obviously, right? 6 months is half a year, so T is going to be half, but it's coded to years. But anyways, that will be, I'll just throw that in the calculator and see what our balance will be on our credit card after just 6 months. And so if I do all that, raised to the 6th power, which would be $905.36. And so what that's implying is that we borrowed $800 and we're going to have to pay back $900. And while that might not seem too crazy because I got $100 interest over 6 months, that was actually a very extreme amount because it's really the annual percentage yield is probably like high 20%. And over 6 months, that's about half of that. It should be growing somewhere 13, 14%, which is a very high amount. And this is just something to be careful about. Sometimes people will put stuff on their credit card and forget to pay it off, but there are pretty extreme implications to not paying it off. And another important recommendation is to know the interest rates of your card. If that way, if you know it and you're aware of how much you're going to be charged, you're less likely to let it slide for a couple months or to forget about it. Now, sometimes, you really just need something. A TV is probably not something you need, but sometimes if you really need something and you don't have the money, a credit card could be a way to buy it. But there's probably a smarter way to purchase something you really need at a lower interest rate than 25%. So anyways, and again, this was assuming no payments, but you also can pay it off obviously as soon as you can. And this is just the thing about credit cards. If you have credit card debt, you should try to pay it off right away because over time, this will just get higher and higher and higher. And this is a hole that a lot of people get themselves in because they get used to buying things on their credit card and not really considering if they can actually afford it. And that's kind of the thing I meant before. Can I afford it? Can I really pay it back? And if we don't pay it back, it will get worse and worse and worse. And how a lot of people choose to deal with this is they'll go get a different credit card and max it out. And if you're maxing out all your credit cards, each one of them is generating a substantial amount of debt, and it's like digging a hole that can be difficult or impossible to get out of depending on your income. And a lot of times the people that are digging these holes don't have the income to do this. So that's kind of going back. A general recommendation about debt, which is on the last page, is, um, you know, don't, just basic tips: pay off your balance in full, avoid credit cards with finance charges. So like this is something that doesn't really happen anymore, but some credit cards will charge you for various things, like to do certain things, you know, which is not good, because most you can easily get a credit card that does not charge you for various services. um, and you really just don't buy things you can't afford. The very basic principles of financial wellness. Um, you can pay off things early, and just because you can do it doesn't mean you can afford to do it. But anyways, in the next video, we will discuss the amortization formula, which is basically a formula for dealing with installment loans and paying them off. So we'll talk a little bit about the formula, the idea, and then we'll do a couple examples of using it, and looking at debt from a larger scale perspective than credit cards.